Well, after a few days in Benicia, what we've learned is it's a wonderful town and the weather sure is beautiful. It's a beautiful Sunday morning today, isn't it? So let's all welcome our former chair and great friend of Indianapolis, Lynn Vincent, for the opening prayer.
Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much for this beautiful day, for these people who have for decades been determined to remember the men of Indianapolis, those who didn't make it, those who have passed away since the rescue. And now we are so thankful to have Harold with us, the last man standing, as someone mentioned to me this morning. He was the last man standing as he said he would be. And we're so thankful for him, and we want to dedicate this time to you this morning to remember all those who didn't make it out of the water and those who have passed on. And we ask your blessing on this time of remembrance. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Lynn. So welcome to this gathering of remembrance for the brave crew of USS Indianapolis. Today's event expands on a tradition that started in 1960 with the first gathering of Indy survivors. The keynote speaker on the memorial service that Sunday morning in 1960 was Rear Admiral Redfield Mason, the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Fleet Operations. That was a different time. The survivors had not yet begun their campaign to exonerate their captain. Hence, the active Navy still loved them and still participated in their reunions. You see, there was a period in the 1960s that seems to have ended in November 1968 for reasons that you all understand, when the Navy still told the truth as it pertains to the causes for the loss of the ship. As Captain McVeigh sat in the audience at that 1960 reunion, the CNO's representative was borderline poetic, saying out loud the same things we've been saying all these past decades, that the ship had been lost due to a tragedy of circumstance and fate rather than malfeasance. If you would permit me to read a few lines from Admiral Mason's 1960 speech, here is what he said. And remember, Captain McVeigh was in the audience as he said it. We are gathered here this morning in memory of the gallant men who died in the sinking of a gallant ship, the United States ship Indianapolis, 15 years ago today. Many here had loved ones who perished in that terrible ordeal. Here also are many who, through God's mercy, survived. There was a particular aura of tragedy about the sinking of the Indy. Almost on the morrow, peace would come, bringing an end to the casualties of war. That so great a sacrifice could be extracted at the very dawn of victory, to which the Indy and her gallant crew had contributed so much, was then and still remains beyond human understanding. Moreover, it seemed that every cruel and unlikely mischance which the cauldrons of war could brew combined to magnify the disaster. Thus it is that the sinking of the Indy may well be chosen both as the epitome of tragedy and the waste of war, as a ringing challenge to action today for the preservation of the peace with justice for which so many of her crew gave their lives. Only God in his infinite wisdom knows why in that war, so treacherously forced upon us, some died while others lived, or why some died early and others late. We can only know that the dead of the Indy played just as heroic and necessary a role in the final victory as any other of the vast host who gave up their lives in that long struggle. And so we, their loved ones, their shipmates, their comrade in arms, and their fellow Americans have come here today to pay tribute to their memory. And that was the official Navy representative's speech in 1960. And sadly, how the Navy's narrative changed over the next 8 years and those years following Captain McVeigh's death. And so it was that the Navy, at least then, properly eulogized our beloved lost shipmates. And so it was that Captain McVeigh was beguiled into believing, at least for a moment, that the Navy no longer blamed him. And so it was that the families and friends heard a proper tribute to their sacrifice, if only until now. And as all of you know, in the last year, we lost one more survivor, a very dear friend, a very dear shipmate. And to tell you more about him, let me welcome back Lynn Vincent.
I had the pleasure of knowing Cletus, not like many of you did, but he was a dear, dear man and such a sweet brother as well. He was one of the longest serving crew members, and he came from a great big family. Didn't he have like 11 brothers and sisters? I know he had enough brothers and sisters that when they all got together, they could actually play football in the backyard with almost 2 full teams. That's how many brothers and sisters he had. And he was very involved with the survivors organization. In fact, he was the chaplain for a long time. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is that while the men were in their ordeal in the water, he taught many of them to pray the Lord's Prayer. And I just find that very, very poignant. It would be an honor for me to lead you in that prayer this morning. I know some of you may not know the prayer, but these are ancient words that were given by Jesus to his disciples when they said, "Lord, teach us to pray." And I think just in honor of those men, many of whom were saying it for the first time, the very first time in the water, in this travail that was one of the most epic human trials in history, I think it's good for us to say it together. So bow your heads with me, and if you know the prayer, say it with me. And if you don't, just know that these are ancient words given to humanity over 2,000 years ago. Pray with me. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and give us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory. Amen.
The USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization stood up in support of that initial 1960 reunion. And over the years, initially every 5 years, and then every 2 years, and then every year, the survivors got together and remembered their fallen shipmates, but the focus of the survivors organization was often their fallen survivors, the survivors that had been lost since the rescue in 1945. As the number of survivors dwindled, it became clear that somebody was going to have to pick up the slack. The survivors' motto was always, never give up. The legacy organization was crafted with the motto, never forget. And as the legacy organization started picking up the slack from the survivors organization, we tried our best to cast a wider net, to not just focus on the survivors. Of course, we would still do that, but also increasingly focus on the lost at sea, the rescue crew who were responsible for there being any survivors to begin with, and of course, the forgotten sailors of Indianapolis, the sailors whose stories dwindled into the shadows of history because they weren't there to tell their stories, they weren't there to reenact or remember what had happened to them. And a few years ago, we recognized that there was one category of Indianapolis sailors that nobody talked about. In my 20-plus years of association, 25 years of association with the Indianapolis, nobody talked about them. And in fact, I'm not sure it was even implanted on my consciousness that there was this silence. Sometimes when there's silence, the very silence creates an emptiness that causes you to not be associated, not understand the impact of the group that you've been silent about. And so a few years ago, a group of family members of fallen Indianapolis sailors began to correct this injustice and put together the narrative and the story of who we call heroes in the shadows. And a book was written to describe the people, the human beings, these real living people who loved their families and who wanted to live and wanted to survive that terrible ordeal, but sadly were not able to. So Hero in the Shadows was published recently, and today is the great book release that we were hoping to have all these months ago. And to help us celebrate their story and the importance of this book, because it's an important book, not merely in the framework of African Americans in World War II. It's an important book in the framework of the United States Navy in World War II. It tells a true Navy story that we can't hide from. We need to understand, and we need to make sure we learn the lessons from that terrible story. And so to help us share that story, please welcome Jane Gwynn Goodall, daughter of rescue pilot Chuck Gwynn, Arlene Taylor, niece of Henry Jackson, Jackie Dugan, niece of Magellan Williams, Jeanette Pitts, niece of Albert Rice. Please welcome these. And Ernestine Pete, I'm sorry.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, good. We have our whole committee minus one up here. Jackie Dugan is on the program to speak, but Jackie was unable to be here at the last minute. She had to cancel her trip for health reasons. So her part of the presentation today will be made by her sister, Ernestine. Good morning. Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege for us to be here today to share this important yet little known history of Indy's story. This is a special day. It's particularly special for me too to be standing here today, and I don't want to break down, but today is the 30th anniversary of my dad's passing. What I can say from that is that he would be so pleased that we are all here generations later celebrating this story that meant so much to him and the people that meant so much to him. Over the past 78 years, many historians have documented the USS Indianapolis story. And because of them, we know about USS Indianapolis, what a prestigious ship she was, serving as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ship of state, and valiantly serving as the flagship for Admiral Spruance, the head of the entire Fifth Fleet. I grew up with this story. I know about Indy's triumphs. I know about her tragic demise. I know about the miraculous rescue after 5 nights and 4 days in the deep ocean waters. I'm privileged to have known many of the survivors, and I'm pained by the loss of the 879 who were precious lives right in their prime. It never really occurred to me, that number 879, until the last few years, because I focused so much on the 316 survivors. The stories of Indy that we know collectively come from those survivors. Men like Harold Bray. They told us about life on the ship. They told us about what happened on that fateful night. And they gave accounts of their ordeal trying to survive against all odds in that perilous water after the sinking. When my dad came on the scene, he spotted the oil slick, and he tried to make sense of it. Because of his training, what he thought he saw was an enemy submarine trail. And it wasn't until he turned around, lowered his altitude, and scanned the surface of the water that he found the unexpected. And when it comes to the Indianapolis story, I had a similar moment of reckoning. The unexpected for me came during the process of searching for the photos that you see here. Up until that point, it had been strictly a list of names in the books. Now we were searching for the photos. And Sarah and I, it was the 75th anniversary, we were putting together the commemorative book, and we thought it was a simple task. We naively thought it was a simple task to find photos of 1,195 men. Our goal was the project was to put together a yearbook-style section for the commemorative book, and you see those pages up there on that memory board. I was curious to know more about the individual men who made up the Indy crew. So I invested countless hours. Steve can tell you that. I poured myself into this project. I began spending almost all of my days and nights on Ancestry.com and other sources to find some basic information about these guys, their face, their birth date, their hometown, their rank, we knew. But the other information came to us from the Navy, from the final reports when the notices were sent to their family. And one group that I kept running into a roadblock with was people whose rank was stewards or steward's mate. And it seemed like a brick wall. My father-in-law used to do genealogy, and he would use that term brick wall when he was searching for his orphaned grandfather's information. So honestly, it really seemed very nearly hopeless at times. We had done the media search or the internet search. We had sent out emails, blasted emails to family members that we still had contact information for, or people that had reached out to us. And one email that came in was from a man named Leroy Pitts, who said, who contacted us by email and said he was the brother of Albert Rice. Well, I knew that name. I've been dreaming about these names. I was focused on finding these people. And so that was a serendipitous email. I followed up with a phone call because he gave me his email address and he gave me his phone number, so I called him and we talked for hours. And he talked to me about, well, we both talked about the numerous books that had been written. I sent him additional books that he didn't know about, but he told me about his passion for sharing the story with his family. He is one that kept that family member alive and would always talk about his brother in affectionate terms. So his family grew up knowing him. And I learned that Dr. Pitts, an educator himself, would use the story of the rescue in some of his lessons. He would talk about how you can see something and you don't really know what you're seeing until you take a closer look. So he did share his hope that future books would represent the full crew, including the African-American crew. None of the men had survived. Their names and their contributions shouldn't be lost as well. So, as it turned out, the commemorative project, the finishing of that, was not an end, but the beginning of a new challenge for me. Now that I'd seen their faces, I knew we could do better. And I felt we could do better to show a more diverse look of the entire crew. But given the time pressures of the 75th anniversary and getting that commemorative book out, we had to settle for a lot of unknown birth dates, unknown hometowns, and lack of pictures. And you'll still see evidence of that. When you look at those photos and the photos that were up here, if you did not see a picture of one of the crew, you saw their insignia. That was the best we could do. And we are continuing to find more photos and update that. But at the time that we published that first publication, we had 6 photos of individual men. We had one group photo taken in 1942 with no names listed under it of the volunteer gunnery crew. And we had one picture of former crew and Pearl Harbor hero, Dory Miller, who was transferred to Indianapolis 1 week after his heroic efforts in Pearl Harbor. There is soon to be a new aircraft carrier named in his honor. There was another ship that was named in his honor as well, and he is the first African American to ever receive the Navy Cross. In terms of the ages and hometowns, we were lacking information, as I told you. But equally important, we really had no clear idea how many there were in the final sailing crew, what they did on the ship or what had happened to them. So thankfully, I found family members of 3 of those lost at sea crew members who shared an interest in piecing together this part of the Indianapolis' history. And together we formed a crew, embarked on a journey, turned our metaphorical plane around, and did a deep dive into the research to learn their story. So what I know now is an enriched history of USS Indianapolis. There were 28 African Americans on the final sailing crew. And because of the Jim Crow era in which they served, they were in a special, segregated steward's branch, serving the officers and volunteering for gunnery duty in battles. We found additional photos, learned their family stories, and learned their story and have their collective story to share as well as individuals. The women that are up here with me have dedicated the last 2.5 years to this project to research the historical contributions of these hidden heroes. And the book, Heroes in the Shadows, The Untold Story of the African American Sailors on USS Indianapolis, is published for the benefit of the Legacy Organization. All proceeds go to the Legacy Organization. We're grateful to have had the support of so many during this journey to help us shine a light on this previously unknown history. So now it's my honor to introduce you to these gals. They're my friends, and they're Indy family members. We're going to start their presentations with Arlene Taylor. Arlene and her niece, Janice, are related. They're related to Henry Jackson. Henry was one of the oldest members of the crew. We didn't know that when we published the first set of, in the commemorative. We had an unknown birth date, and we had Washington, D.C. as his birthplace. That turned out not to be the case. Following Arlene will be Ernestine Pete, who will be speaking for her sister Jackie on behalf of Magellan Williams, who is their uncle. Jackie was planning to do the presentation today, but as I mentioned, Jackie was unable to be here. And Ernestine will speak for her and for the family. And then anchoring our presentation will be Dr. Jeanette Pitts, who is the niece of Albert Rice and the daughter of Leroy Pitts, Dr. Leroy Pitts, in whose dedication to this story is where we found our inspiration.
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm Arlene Taylor. Jane introduced me. And I hope I'll start off right now by telling you I'm looking at a tablet screen without my glasses. So if I frantically do this, I've lost the screen, okay? But I hope not. I hope that won't work. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a retired educator. And I started my true research probably around the time I retired. I was looking for something to do. And my mother was the person who really alerted me to the fact that her brother was on the USS Indianapolis. And I remember as a young child, I was probably 9 or 10, I loved to hear my mother reminisce about her brother. He was her older brother. He helped look after her and his mother. And when he went off to the Navy, my mother was probably maybe 17 years old or so. But up until that point, her brother Henry was her father figure, was her older brother. And my mother always said, she never knew what happened to him. She got the letter, or her mother got a letter from the Navy Department. But at the time, she just didn't understand why her brother didn't return home. So I grew up with this story being told over and over. I never met her brother, but through my mother, I feel like I know him. And so what I did, as I said, about 20 years ago, I started this research, and like Jane said, I ran into a brick wall. And so I had to reach out, and I did come into contact with an officer at the United States Naval Museum, isn't it? Yeah, Naval Museum. And I happened to be there one day in the building when I just was nosying around in the library. I was there for her husband's retirement. He's a retired Navy person. And I went into the library, and I was standing there, and the officer came over to me, and he says, "How can I help you?" And I said, "Well, my uncle, I think, was in the Navy." And I told him the story about my mother, and I said, "I think he was on USS Indianapolis." And all I knew at that time about USS Indianapolis was from the movie Jaws. I did, as most people, I didn't know much about it at all. She said, "Well, wait a minute, let me look on the computer." So he looked on the computer, my uncle's name came up, which I was really shocked, because I'd done research, I'd gotten some letters, I had received some documentations, newspaper clippings, but never from officially from the Navy Department. So he said, "Well, it looks like your uncle's picture is missing." And I said, "I have a picture of my uncle." And he was like, "Wow." He said, get it to me and we'll put it in the computer. So that's, I guess, how Jane eventually came up with the fact that I had an uncle in the Navy, because all these years I just thought maybe he was the only African-American sailor on the USS Indianapolis, because all the movies I had seen, the books I had read, there was never a mention of anyone of color. So that brings me to actually how we all got together, and that was probably in July or August of 2020 when the gold medal, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded. And Jane sent me an email and asked if I wanted to be a participant on a panel during that 3 or 4 day ceremony. And I said, no. Anyway, I did watch it, and I saw the whole ceremony. I had never heard of the Legacy Organization or the Survivors Organization, but when I saw my uncle's name scroll across the screen, something just exploded in me. I said, no, I've got to follow this through. And so I did get in touch with Jane and said, yeah, I wouldn't mind being a part of whatever you're doing. And surely enough, she called a Zoom meeting. She did not give us a break at all. I think it was 2020. She said, we'll get together on Zoom. And I met Jane via Zoom, and Gina Pitts, and eventually Ernestine. So we formed a group of about 5 of us, and we met via Zoom for the next 2.5 years. So it was just revealing. I learned so much, not only about my uncle, which I didn't have a lot of knowledge about, but I had some paperwork, some documentation. And I told Jane, I said, I don't have much, because my mother was the one who told me about her brother. And she had some letters, some documentation, newspaper clippings, and a few medals in a box. But when she passed, I had no idea what happened to those things. So I told her, I'm coming to you with nothing. But when she looked through my portfolio of things that I had collected, she said, nope, you've got quite a bit here. So she was the one that kind of pulled everything together, and I'm forever grateful to having come in contact with Jane. What do we want from this book? The book, like I said, was 2.5 years of labor, laborious, time-consuming, rewriting, writing, editing, and every time we got to the point where we thought, okay, this is it, somebody else would pop into the picture. Well, let's let someone else look at it. And I told Jane at one time, don't show it to anybody else until we just. But I was extremely proud of the finished product. I know it will bring a long and overdue exposure, this book. I know it will bring a long and overdue exposure to an area of American history that has been ignored for too long. The purpose is not to lay blame or diminish the heroic recognition rightfully given to anyone or to any group. Instead, the purpose is to illuminate and expand those honors. The historical and social content of Heroes in the Shadows will motivate our society to see the whole and complete picture. The truth should never be ignored or cast into darkness. Heroes in the Shadows will help lay the basis for an honest and thorough record of historical events, not excluding any particular group due to race or gender or social standing. The truth should be thorough. The truth should be inclusive. History should be based on truth. Where there are no exclusions, there is no truth. Where there are exclusions, there is no truth. For only by facing our omissions and our mistakes with an unbiased analysis of events can we as a nation grow stronger together and more united in our focus and in our causes. No one can change the past. However, we can change our path. I wish to thank Jane and the officers and members of the USS Indianapolis Legacy Organization for supporting the writing and publication of Heroes in the Shadows. And if you haven't bought a copy, I hope that you will buy not just one, but two. Keep one for yourself and give one as a gift. Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Ernestine Pete, and I am sharing these words written by my sister, Jacqueline Dugan. She was unable to be here with us this weekend. We are the nieces of Stuart's mate, First Class Magellan Williams. I always knew my uncle died in the war, but no one ever told me when or how. One night, while watching a World War II documentary on television, my husband turned to me and said, "This is the ship that your uncle was on." He pointed at the TV to the image of USS Indianapolis. Excited, I grabbed a videotape and recorded the documentary to give it to my mother. However, when I presented it to her, I immediately knew from her reaction that she'd never watch it. It was already common knowledge in my family that the mere mention of Uncle Magellan's name or the ship on which he served would instantly elect tears. Unsurprisingly to me, she later claimed the tape was lost and she was never able to watch it. As for me, I was undeterred. Once I found out my uncle was on USS Indianapolis when it went down, I made it my mission to find out more about him and the ship. After connecting with one of the organizers, I was invited to attend the USS Indianapolis reunion in 2001. I brought a picture of my uncle to the event with me, and while making my way through the crowd, I asked person after person if they knew my uncle. Each time, all I got in response was the same blank look or a quick shake of the head. Eventually, I realized how unlikely it was that any of these men had any idea who my uncle was. Why would they? It's widely documented that Black sailors were segregated from the rest of the crew, assigned other duties, shifts, and quarters that their white counterparts. I felt helpless. I felt hopeless. I felt like my uncle's story was lost that night in 1945. But I also realized the same was true for so many others. There was more than enough pain to go around. Over the years, I continued to seek ways to connect with this missing piece of my family's history. When the pandemic hit a few years ago, I had my first conversation with Jane Goodall by phone, and her enthusiasm reignited my own. When she proposed this project to me and the other ladies on the committee, I knew it was serendipitous. My individual efforts of chronicling my uncle's history was going to join an even larger one, telling the story of the 28 African-American sailors about USS Indianapolis, who often went unheard and unseen. Not only has this project been a labor of love, it has been a path towards remembrance, connections, and healing for my family. Over the years, I've taken my family to Indianapolis to visit the memorial on numerous occasions and told them little I knew of my Uncle Magellan's childhood in Louisiana. As my sister Ernestine and I learned of and became more involved in the USS Indianapolis CA-35 Legacy Organization, something unexpected happened. After years of reluctance, my mother opened up about her memories of her big brother, Magellan, something that up to that point had been nearly impossible for her to do without breaking down into tears. Adding to that, my father's recounting of his experience in boot camp and serving in the Navy at the same time as Magellan, and the picture of life of a Black sailor during World War II came into sharper focus. These conversations about Magellan's life and the aftermath of his death sparked curiosity in other members of our family to learn more about the history of the USS Indianapolis and that fateful night in 1945. As my siblings and the younger generations of our family have heard more, they wanted to learn more. These moments had led to stronger, familiar bonds and imparted lessons in the importance of legacy. While Magellan Williams' time on this earth was tragically short, the ripples of his memory continue to permeate and bolster my family's collective spirit. This is why I honor his service, why I became involved in the legacy organization, and why I joined the endeavors to bring heroes in the shadows to life. To create a living memorial of the lives of the 28 African American sailors who perished on the USS Indianapolis, that preserves their memories for those that left behind and for those yet to arrive. To the heroes, Erlene, Ernestine, Gina, and Janice, thank you for the long calls, the hard work, love, and persistence to see the work to its completion. We did it. An immense and lasting thank you to Jane Goodall, who understood the tremendous importance of giving voice to these silent sailors and the necessity for their lives to be chronicled in this book. Your passion for this project propelled us all to push past our doubts toward our ultimate goal to honor the memory of these men whose legacies live on. 2 months ago, I was able to give a copy of Heroes in the Shadows to my mother. To see her reaction, so different from what it had been years before, brought me to tears. I know my uncle was smiling down on us that day. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Jeanette Pitts, also known as Gina. I am the daughter of Leroy Pitts, whose brother Albert Rice was one of the crew who was lost at sea. As Jane mentioned, my dad was actually 13 when his brother died. He has always longed for his story and the story of the African American sailors to be told. He raised me and my 3 siblings to know our uncle, just to know him like we know any other family member. And in fact, early on in our meetings, Jane asked me if I wanted to do the bio on Albert Rice. And it was actually awkward for me to use that term, Albert Rice. He's Uncle Bud. You don't call him by his first name like that. My dad has been very, very motivated with respect to the Indianapolis. The first event that I believe was open to Lost at Sea family members in the 1995 reunion, my father did attend. And he did come to the podium at that time and wanted to acknowledge, wanted people to recognize that there were African American sailors and ask that as you write your books, please remember us, remember the African American sailors. He joined the Second Watch organization before there was a legacy organization, and actually corresponded with some of the survivors. And in fact, I think we have in the book a little correspondence that he sent to Edgar Harrell. At any rate, when he did get the book, he penned some comments that I would like to share with you today, and then just share a very brief comment of my own. My father wrote, "When I saw the book Heroes in the Shadows, a welcomed joy came over me. The joy was expressed not with loud words of gladness, but with a quietness as I just sat staring at the cover that had words that moved me. This quietness with internal joy was followed by my realization that I was looking at the fulfillment of a long-awaited hope. It was then that my eyes began to tear up. In fleeting moments, I recalled how as a young teenager, I wanted something to be done to let it be known that my brother and others like him were part of the crew of a famous ship, USS Indianapolis. I did not know how such hope could be brought about, but the thought remained bottled up in my youthful mind. I thought it wrong for historians not to mention what was evident in my young mind, namely, that a wrong had been done. As I matured in thought, I knew there was little to be gained by dwelling on what happened or who was at fault. It was not long before I was comforted by the cultural teaching of my Afro-American upbringing. Our roots are deep into theistic thinking, which is often stated in many ways. An example is when Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Even before Dr. King's expression of this theistic position, I was exposed to it by the teaching of my folks. This is better understood by the quote, "Scripture is clear in teaching that light will triumph over darkness, that God's love is more powerful than human sin." And I'll stop there just to say, if you open my dad's Bible, he actually has that written in his Bible that he carries with him at all times. Going on to his letter, "I know to accomplish any goal, one must have the ability, power to get it done. Then he must have the will to do whatever is the goal. With this being true, it would not be an unfair extrapolation to say that many had the power or ability to mediate the lack of reporting the Black crew member situation, but they lacked the will to do it. So with all the above reasoning being the underpinnings of my thoughts, I rejoiced the more I read the book, for it was evident that someone with power, ability, and will was at work to get it written. When the crew members were spotted by Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn, they were seen by a man who had the power to help them. When he dropped lower to take a closer look, it says he also had the will to get it done. When Ms. Jane Goodall learned about the oversight of Afro-Americans, she realized that she had the ability to do something. Formation of a committee to work to do something is evidence that she and the legacy organization had the will to get it done. Then there was the committee. On being contacted, members with busy lives altered daily obligations in order to work on the committee, and to persist in doing so showed they had the will to give their best. When I completed reading the book, I wanted to say thanks to Ms. Goodall, the committee members Janice Alston, Jacqueline Dugan, Ernestine Pete, my daughter Jeanette Pitts, MD, and Arlene Taylor, Commander Philpott, and Captain William Toady. May heaven's best be yours. Job well done. I would just like to say that each of us, we've all shared our personal sentiments with you. Nonetheless, for each person here today, remembrance is key. It empowers us for the future. As we acknowledge and honor all those who suffered and served aboard USS Indianapolis, we are reminded that we are the light that can and must continue to triumph over all of the darkness of the world that they endured. In remembrance of their sacrifice, we are empowered to carry on. Thank you.
I think we'll now, are we taking questions? We can, if you'd like, take a few questions, or we can go on to the closing remarks with Bill. You have a question?
Yes, can you explain the mechanics of you all working together via Zoom? Who did the writing? How did you exchange info, et cetera?
So a lot of it was, how do we start? So we started with a lot of unknown information. We actually had a very naive goal at the beginning, which was just to find the pictures and do something like this and do a pictorial. But the more that we started learning their story, the more we felt it was important to share some of the backstory and the context for this. So we each had sort of roles and responsibilities. Janice did a lot of the Ancestry.com because she really enjoys that. Gina was really good as I did a lot of the writing and putting it together and the data keeping. I kept it all together. But we all had opportunities to weigh in on that and then to tweak it and to ask the questions. And the more we asked the questions, then we developed kind of the line of story. So our initial 6-month goal of having something became, as Arlene said, it seemed like it was going to go on forever. We're still searching for photos. We started with 6. We have only 11. The rest of the 28 are still represented by insignia. We will always be searching for that. At first, it was a big task just to figure out how many there were. We had their titles to go to, and that steward's mate was something that white people were not able to be in that. That was specially created for African Americans and Filipino nationals. Filipino nationals, people from outside the country, and American citizen African Americans. So we looked at that first and did a deep dive on the steward's mates to come up with our numbers and verify the names and the race. And then we found, because one of them had a rank of cook, we also looked at cook, not to be confused with general mess cook, but this was officer's mess cook. So there was that branch that we looked at, and we came up with 26. And then we went, no, we didn't come up with 26 at that. Then we did, for every person that you see represented that only had insignia, we did a deep dive into that. Because one of our African-American crew was a seaman first class, so it was possible they could have had something else. It's an unrated rank, right? So we did a deep dive into all of this, the whole crew, whatever their rating was, and came up with a couple more there. And we ended up with a total of 28. That's how we came up with our number. Verified it multiple times. I can't tell you how many times in my head, in my sleep, I would think of things and then the next day go back and do another dive. The same with photos. It was even just the last minute, the last final edit. Thank God we did have all these edits and revisions and stuff, because in that last week of edits, I thought, well, what's the possibility that somebody may have contributed a family thing into their family tree in Ancestry.com? And we came up with Jackson Latigue's photo at that point. So we have 11 photos, we do set some context in the book for what was happening in the Navy at that time. We do talk a little bit about what has happened in the Navy since. Their stories are really, really interesting, and you can find a lot on these sites. I mean, there's a fellow that was one of the stewards who has a tombstone in Arlington National Cemetery, a memorial stone. We found the application that his mother had made for that stone, and we found it crossed off saying not applicable. But to that mother's credit, she was tenacious, and she got that stone for him in the memorial. And there are lots of stories like that. One of the crew members' brothers, well, we had him listed down for Rome, New York. Couldn't find any information on him. Rome, New York is what the Navy had. We could not find his draft card or any information on him. But we did a little bit deeper dive into the census information and found that his family was from Henning, Tennessee. Henning, Tennessee is the home of the man who wrote Roots, Alex Haley. Two of Clarence Sims' brothers were best friends with Alex Haley, and they worked with him, and they're credited in Alex Haley's book, Roots. The things that you find when you're curious never will cease to amaze you. Want to close? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Pardon me?
Filipino stewards.
Yes, there was one. There was one, and he was 37 years old. And 37 years old, his name is Punciano Holden. His picture is in the book. I have met his family too, but he was the only one that was still there. And he was the highest ranking of the stewards and stewards' mates.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Did anyone find anybody who had recollections of your relatives?
I think it's no for all of us, and I can say, I remember in '95 when my dad came to the reunion, and at that time he was specifically hoping to find, and he did not, even at that time when there were many others alive, survivors alive.
So the interesting way that, of course, these stewards would have worked in the ship is they would have operated in a very isolated area, the wardroom, officers' country. And so if anybody really knew them, it would have been the officers, very few of whom survived. Those that did survive had only been on board for a few weeks. So that's the challenge here and finding. Yes, ma'am. Okay, yeah. Kim, go ahead.
As a lot of you know, I was very close to John Woolston, survivor from Honolulu, and I spent a lot of time with him. The very last time I saw him alive, he had come over for the honor flight to go to DC and see all of his monuments. And I was bringing him back through security to fly home. And he needed a wheelchair. He didn't want you guys to know that, but he had to use a wheelchair sometimes. So we got a wheelchair pusher at the airport, and he was a young African-American man. And when he was taking him through, John wasn't the most expressive person in the world. He was very, by the book, and you do it right, and you don't show a lot of emotion. But man, we got him to show some emotion at some of these events. Where he really showed emotion is behind the scenes. When we were going through security, the young African-American wheelchair pusher, John turned around and he just opened up, which John didn't do to strangers. And he said, "Young man, I want you to know that the black sailors had it really bad. None of them survived." He then had the young man kneel in front of him in the middle of the airport, and he told him his story one-on-one. that night that John was just gotten off watch, right where torpedo number 2 hit, he went up to the officer's mess and he ordered a ham sandwich and a coffee. He reenacted this in a video that I have on the, when we were aboard the USS Missouri. He then, after the steward's mate gave it to him, he went and sat down. The first torpedo hit and the flame swirled inward from the front. The second one hit came from below and came through the back doors. John said he hit the deck, he jumped up, and he jumped through the pantry window in there with that steward. He was trying to get out because by then everything was happening, the ship was starting to list, and he couldn't get out any of the portholes. The young steward who was back there, who had just given him his food, found the wrench that saved John's life. And he said to this wheelchair pusher, he said, he got me out, and I turned around, and because it was filling up with smoke in there. And he said, get out, come on, come on. And the young man said, the steward said, I need just a minute to catch my breath. And John goes, please don't wait, please get out. And he went out the porthole and up top, and John lived, and the steward did not. And as he's told this wheelchair pusher this story, John broke down in the middle of SeaTac Airport, which, as we know, John didn't break down. And he just needed to share this. And I needed to share this with you guys because one of my best friends was alive because of somebody's relative. And I want you to know they're not forgotten. And John died 2 months after sharing that moment. And thank you for sharing your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I hope we caught some of that on the audio for the recording. But this really does drive home the point. The title of the book is Heroes in the Shadows. And the title Heroes is not honorific. It's true. It's true. They were real heroes. Not heroes because they died, but heroes because of what they did when they were alive. And we can't forget that. I said at the beginning that this book is not just an important book for the African American experience in the Navy. It's an important book for the Navy. And we should all do what we can to get this book out so that the public can understand what the experience of these young sailors was and how important it was. As the speech I read from the Admiral just a minute ago said, every one of those who died played just as important a role in the victory as those who lived. And this is a prime example of that. Thank you, Kim. And now Harold Bray our last remaining survivor, will lay a rose in tribute to all of his lost shipmates. Thank you, Harold. Our motto is never forget. Dr. Pitts shared with us that her father's favorite quote from the Bible is, "The light will help overcome the darkness." I know I didn't get that exactly right. We don't merely have an opportunity to be the light that defeats the darkness. When we say never forget, that means we have an obligation to be the light that defeats the darkness. As we leave here today, let's remember that, and let's each of us commit to be that light. Thank you, and God bless. And as our tradition always been, we're going to end with the song, "Till We Meet Again." We usually have a quartet here to help us sing it, and I don't sing. So we're gonna join the Mormon Tabernacle Choir here, singing "Till We Meet Again." I see that you all like singing as much as I do. Tom would like to come up. He says he has a story that needs to be told, and I guess we're going to give him the opportunity to tell it. Come on, Tom. Thank you. Sure.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Graves. I've gotten to meet a few of you this weekend. This is my first time at the Indianapolis event. Because of the significance of this book and what we've just heard, I have to share this with you, and I bet many of you will be hearing this for the very first time. I learned this about 10 days ago. The American Civil Rights Movement did not start in Selma. or Montgomery or with LBJ. It started 8 miles east of where I'm standing today. July 17th, 1944, the Port Chicago disaster. African-American men in segregated units, African-American sailors, were given the job of unloading trains coming from all over the United States, carrying munitions for the Pacific War. Bombs, shells, everything you can imagine. They were given very little training. They worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And on July 17th, there was a disaster. 2 ships were loaded with, one was loaded with munitions, one was being loaded with munitions. There was an explosion. I'm told because one of their cranes was poorly maintained because they had to work so fast. They were driven to work so fast by Caucasian officers. 320 men disintegrated that day. 390 others were terribly wounded. 2 ships were sunk that were being loaded. One disintegrated. A pilot going by said he saw 3 miles up a piece of metal go by the size of a garage. Windows were broken in San Francisco from the explosion. The Navy, of course, blamed the African-American sailors. 200 refused to go back to work until they were better trained to safely handle these munitions. They were threatened with court-martial, of course. 150 went back to work, 50 did not. They were eventually court-martialed. On their defense team was Thurgood Marshall, a soon-to-be member of the Supreme Court. But I'm told, without question, the Port Chicago tragedy was responsible for the Navy being desegregated, then the armed forces being segregated, and that tragedy and that tremendous loss of life was actually the event that bore the American civil rights efforts. So only because of this book and only because we're sitting 8 miles, I just looked on the map, 8 air miles to the east. Not sure which way that is. And many of you visiting from out of town may never be here or this close again. I felt I had to share that with you. So thank you.
The story you told of Port Chicago is true. It's true that the Navy did court-martial, not tried to, but actually did court-martial those sailors who refused to work. And the court-martial, decades later, those sailors were exonerated, much like Captain McVeigh. The link between that and the American Civil Rights Movement, I don't know that lineage. I would say that that is one in a series of tens of thousands of events that led to the need for civil rights. And that might have been one of the big ones, but it certainly wasn't the only one. So again, thank you all for coming, and let's all be that light.